Hello, and welcome to another episode of Intentionally Act Live. This is your host, Enrico E. Manalo, and I am joined today by the wonderful Dr. Tina M. Harris of LSU, who is the very first Douglas I. Manship Sr. Dori J. Maynard Endowed Chair in Race, Media, and Cultural Literacy. How are you today, Dr. Tina?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Could you tell us a little bit more about your what it means to be the first endowed chair at LSU?
Sure. Um, this endowment means that the families, excuse me, I'm sorry, the families such as the Manship family and the Maynard family and other individuals who are affiliated with LSU, whether they're alumni or just donors, uh, donated a significant amount of money to fund someone to come and do research in the areas of race, media, and cultural literacy. And when I applied for the position, or I was invited to apply, I did not know that this is the first of its kind in the country. So it's a little bit overwhelming. I won't say that there's a lot of pressure, but I have the opportunity to do the research that I was already doing when I was at the University of Georgia, which is where I was for 21 years. So
Mm.
being an endowed chair means that you have uh, a a number of people who are invested in your vision and have, I mean, they're invested in it financially, but also ethically and morally and professionally, because they want to see more courses taught and more research conducted in those different areas.
So what you're saying is it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I appreciate about it is that it provides me with resources so that I can, pay for graduate students to fund them, sometimes during the summer, or if they need resources to do studies and help me with a project, I have those resources available to me,
Yeah.
and I can do some initiatives in the community. I have the resources to do that. Beforehand, it was either doing things. Well, I was not able to do all the work that I want to do, and so
Yeah.
that limited me in a significant way. But now that I have these resources, I feel empowered.
So, for those who might not know, when you say do all the work that you want to do, some watching who are not familiar with your work might not know exactly how prolific you are. But just for a little bit of context, Tina and I were talking the other day, and she mentioned that she has a book contract with some pretty big, like a pretty big deal publisher, and she actually couldn't remember exactly which pretty big deal publisher it was. So like that's how big a deal Tina is.
It's Roman and Littlefield.
That is a big deal. You are such a prolific scholar, and I'm just so curious. And I ask this of many of our guests, but what is it exactly that made you fall in love with what you do?
Oh, I guess you could say there are a number of things. Uh, I would I would start out by saying that it started when I was maybe, I don't know if it officially started when I was 2.5, but I come from a military family. My dad was in the Navy, and he and my mother made the wonderful decision to move from to move from Detroit, Michigan, which is where I was born, and we moved to Rhoda, Spain. We lived there. We moved there
Wow.
when I was 2.5 and lived there for 4.5 years. And that
Wow.
had a profound impact on me. I think probably in ways that I never would have imagined. I have an older brother and an older sister, and because I was so young, I mean, I wasn't able to go to school, and it was common for military families to hire local women to be housekeepers, and so I stayed at home with Milagros all day long.
Wow.
And my mom told, she was kidding when she said this a few years ago, but she told me that Spanish was my first language, and I was like, you know what, I'll take that. But I remember, just walking around the house speaking Spanish with her and everything, and I think having that an exposure or really immersion rather, in a different culture, just really opened up my eyes at an early age to the beauty of humanity. And I
Yeah.
think that really, planted a seed. And I guess what I would say also, is that it has that experience really showed me how simple some things are in life in terms of humanity and connecting with other people. I mean, when I was there, I mean, of course, I was a child and there was only so much I could do, but I just loved the fact that, wow, I'm around all these people who are speaking this language. I love the culture. And I think that that really set the foundation for me just having a, I guess you could say, to some extent, a simplistic attitude toward diversity. I just still don't get it, why people have the different prejudices and biases. I'm just like, we're all people. We're all, made in God's sight. I mean, yeah. So it's just baffling to me that people will take our differences and turn them into weapons. So that they'll, weaponize them or even create division. So I would say that my interest in diversity started at a very young age, and then as I got older, I started to see that, white flight in our neighborhood growing up, and just not understanding, well, wait a minute, there used to be some white people that live in our neighborhood, and now they don't live here anymore. And as I got older, I just became more aware of the biases that exist and the barriers that have been set up in society that prevent people from different races coming together and also perpetuate systemic oppression. So I started out just thinking everything is great and wonderful, and why can't we all just get along? Why do we need to fight? Why do we need to have wars? But reality hit. I won't say it hit pretty quickly, but I had an awakening at some point to realize that, wow, it's not as I won't say that I was looking at the world through rose-colored glasses, but I was just hopeful, that things would be a little bit better. So now I'm just doing my part to make sure that happens.
So, in case it hasn't become abundantly clear to our viewers, your specialization is actually in communication. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how communication and advancing racial equity kind of come together. Maybe another way of looking at that is like, well, what is good communication, and why is there such a deep need for different groups of people to be able to communicate with one another well?
Mhm. Okay. So in order for us to communicate effectively, we need to, be aware of the messages that we're trying to communicate to other people. One of the principles of communication is that you cannot not communicate. People think that communicating is easy and it's common sense. Even when students take our introductory level courses, they think, oh, it's a piece of cake, but they realize that communication is much more complex than they would actually like to give it credit for. So I think that people really need to be not just mindful of, but appreciative of the fact that communication is complex. I mean, you have to
Yes.
invest in it.
Yes.
You have to be committed to being a better communicator. And that doesn't mean that those of us who study communication are, perfect communicators. We are human, just like everybody else. And we, always strive to improve how we communicate, with other people. But I think that, when it comes to diversity, communication is key. I mean, let me back up a little bit. Communication is key in all relationships. So
Yeah.
whether it's a familial relationship or friendship or even a romantic relationship, uh, both partners or people, really do need to know how to communicate well. I mean, people
Hmm.
have different communication styles, and sometimes they adapt to that, and sometimes people just don't get the other person because their styles are different as well as their ways of thinking. And then when we consider racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity and diversity in terms of the LGBTQIA plus community, we are bringing those aspects of our identity to the table, and those forms of identity or types of identity will shape the way that we experience the world, and ultimately they impact how we communicate with other people. And because we are people, and we're humans, we are oftentimes in our people group, and sometimes we don't realize that when you step out of your group and you're communicating with other people, that there's a potential for miscommunication to occur. We know that it can occur, just in your quote unquote regular, relationships, but when you are communicating with people outside of your group, there's a possibility that um, the miscommunication is going to increase. And some of that also probably has to do with anxiety or stress that
Yeah.
people have about communicating with someone who's different from them.
For those watching who might not know, I was an English as a foreign language and English as a second language teacher for about 10 years. And it's actually what led to me becoming a conflict resolution practitioner. Because I ultimately found that it wasn't just the vocabulary and the grammar that I was helping my students with, but understanding the cultural layers, right? And in navigating those things that seem to cause conflict. One of the striking lessons that I learned from teaching, because again, the teacher-student relationship is very much a relationship, and teachers, if they're not learning from their students, they're probably not teaching very well.
Hmm.
But one of the things that I learned was the complexity of navigating not only another language and another society. We express that kind of stress in various ways, like it might be a furrowed brow or something like that. And so my students would go out into Boston, where I was teaching, and they would use correct grammar, correct vocabulary, what have you, and then they would come back and say like, "Well, I tried to say this, this, and this, but the person didn't understand what I was saying." And as they were repeating it back to me, you could see like their faces get all scrunched up, and then their voices, because they're focusing so much on getting it right, wasn't rising and falling in the way that native English speakers, particularly Americans, are used to. And that was another layer of communication that I hadn't really considered, how much emotion we encode in the rise and fall of our voice. And along with tone is our facial expressions. So my students, in some cases, were asking rather innocuous things or trying to communicate, but their face was all like this, and the tone was kind of flat. And so because of those things, people who are not language learners were kind of like, I don't know exactly what you want from me right now, you know?
Oh yeah.
And it's just a great lesson, again, about how, one, language is complexity, but we are using this complexity to try to navigate even greater complexity.
Oh, without a doubt. Hmm.
So, I'm just kind of curious, like, from your end, what are some kind of takeaways? Because you've been such a prolific author on various things related to communication. Like, what are some takeaways that you've come away with?
Okay, some takeaways from like my research or from my students.
Yeah, I mean, either one, both maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I learned a lot from my students. Well, number one, they kind of keep me hip and let me know what music is in, what's out, and what the latest thing is in terms of popular culture. So I appreciate that. But more importantly, they stretch me in terms of how I can teach effectively in the classroom.
Mm.
When you have a group of students that come together, you've got for example, this semester I had a class with 30 undergraduates in it, and they all have different personalities. They all, have different backgrounds and lived experiences and perceptions and worldviews. And you have to take all that, into consideration when you're teaching. And it doesn't mean that you have to change every aspect of your classroom instruction, but you have to be flexible because you have a different dynamic, of a group. Every time you teach a new class, there's a different dynamic. You have different people coming together who have never been together before, and you have to really make it work. And this semester, well, just like last semester, I taught all online, and I hate that I did not have the opportunity to meet my students in person, but I had to take my skills in a traditional classroom and translate to an online platform.
Not an easy task.
Not an easy task at all. And so, I would try to, I like to be engaged with my students, and, I like to see their face. I like to, get them, involved in the class discussion. And that was, I imagined that was kind of hard to do, because I'm like, I'm looking at 29 other people on the screen or 30 people on the screen, and how can I reach them? How can I, get them invested in this course? And this semester, my class was a little bit more quiet. Yeah, they were quieter than my class from last fall, but I really learned so much from them, when I would read their assignments. I mean, because I was like, this class doesn't speak up that much. I mean, you have some people who, do contribute a lot to the discussion, but I'm like, wow. I mean, students are, telling you a lot about their personal lives and, and the experiences that they have had. And I mean, it relates to the course in that, I'm asking them to apply what they're learning. And so to me, that's just like, pretty amazing that students will allow themselves to be vulnerable. And I
Yeah.
think part of that has to do, with my ability to create. I don't want to sound. I don't want to say safe space because that sounds so cliche. But I
Yeah.
want to, create an environment that is conducive to true learning. And I'm not teaching them to the test. I'm teaching them so that they can, understand the different concepts and the theories and that deal with multiculturalism and diversity, and then see how that is going to impact their lives beyond the classroom.
Yeah.
And so I think that the different assignments that I have allows them to make those connections between the course content and the real world, in ways that maybe other courses cannot. And so I want them to know that there is significance and there's relevance, in the courses that they're taking with me. And so I learn not just about not just about how to teach better, but how can I be a better person? How can I be more compassionate if someone has a different worldview than me?
Yeah.
Um, how can I, be a better person as a result of, having my path crossed with so many different people?
So in the you mentioned that it's quite the challenge to teach in this online format, and that you really are not teaching to a test, but you're really trying to equip your students for the greater world that they will be facing.
Yes.
I think it's like undeniable right now that we are living in a world that is full of mass communication, right? So like perhaps many layers removed from like a personal interaction.
Oh,
And of course, in this era of mass communication, there's another layer of added complexity, which is, representation of racialized groups, and the messages that get played over and over again and get reinforced. So I wonder if you can touch on that a little bit.
yeah. I enjoy the media. I mean, I enjoy, Netflix. I enjoy a number of series that are on there. I love television programs that can, offer a form of entertainment. But there also is the risk of, not necessarily the risk, but when we're watching the news and we're seeing, coverage of all of these different current events, I mean, it can be really, overwhelming. Not just because we're in a pandemic. Yes, we're in a pandemic, but we're also in a racial pandemic,
Yes.
and there's a great deal of coverage of, some really horrible things that are going on in our country, and you have to like moderate that, and that's what I personally do. I also, when I'm in the classroom, I want my students to make those connections between what we're learning in class and how does this relate to not only the real world, but we're talking about current events. And then I also push them to think about how they're going to use this information, in the future in the workplace. And
Hmm.
and I really do appreciate that opportunity to be creative in the classroom because students will come back to me or have come back to me years later and they'll tell me how the class that I taught, and that was at the University of Georgia, interracial communication has, prepared them for the conversations that are going on right now in our society. I had one student email me this past, well, where this is 2021. She emailed me last spring. It was shortly after COVID hit, and we had to, pretty much lock down. She emailed me and it was shortly after the class after this it was after George Floyd's murder, and she was asking me for advice on how to have conversations with family members about the looting and the destruction that was going on in the midst of the protest. And I said, okay, I was busy working on a deadline, but I said, let me just go ahead and take some time to help her have these conversations. And so I think I sat down and I wrote it in like 20 minutes. I came up with a metaphor that a colleague kind of corrected me once I had posted on my Facebook page. But I was saying that for African Americans, and this can apply to other groups as well. When we think about our station in life in the U.S., we are we've been impacted by slavery in a number of ways, and not as a result of, but slavery definitely came into existence because of colonialism and racism. But we don't have slavery anymore, but racism still exists.
Very
And so
much.
I was, her mother or her relatives just really could not get it. And so I said, let me just come up with this metaphor, and the metaphor is that what was it? The metaphor was essentially describing the relationship between blacks and the U.S. As a forced. Well, initially I think I said arranged marriage, and a colleague said it would be better for you to say a forced. I mean, yeah, instead of saying arranged marriage, call it a forced marriage, because we didn't want to stigmatize um, cultures where they do have arranged marriages. I said, you know what, not a problem. Thank you for that information. And so I changed it. But essentially, what I was saying was that in the write up, I said that you have a woman who was betrothed to a country, and she's thinking, I'm getting married and this country is going to take care of me, or in the metaphor it was more so her husband is going to take care of her, but the husband has abused her, and she's gone to officials, she's gone to family members, she's gone to friends, and she's cried out for help, but no one is willing to help her. And she responds to that by lashing out, and pretty much not necessarily being violent, but she lashes out physically. And so
Mm.
that's where we are. And so I wrote that. I sent it to the student, and she was like, this is great, thank you so much. And then she asked me if she could share it with her family members and friends. I was like, sure, go right ahead. And I said, well, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and post this on my Facebook page. So I posted it, and then I got the bright idea of recording myself reading it, and I need to work on that. But at any rate, I did create a video of it and posted it on my page as well, so that other people could look at that video and maybe even use that metaphor to explain, to do the same thing like she did. Use it with your family, your friends, or whomever. And I was stunned to see how many views it got. I think I checked about maybe 3 weeks ago, and I had 5,000 views.
Wow.
I was like, oh, and I think I messaged a former student of mine. I was like, Emma, what is that? What does that mean? I mean, I know what it means. Literally 5,000 people liked it. She was like, it means you're an influencer. I was like, oh, okay. I think I need to put that on my CV. I will do that. But I got joy out of writing that, because that's what I do. And the student needed help, and that's what I created for her. But it was also not necessarily cathartic for me, but it was fulfilling,
Yeah.
because I'm just helping other people understand what I've been taught and learned, and have been learning and living for most of my life.
That analogy is so striking on a number of levels. But one of the things that comes into my mind is that when I used to work with children, teaching them English,
Mhm.
and what I would notice, especially with the young kids, is when they couldn't find ways to express themselves, it would become physical, right? In some way, they might throw a tantrum, they might act out, or conversely, they might simply stop responding, right? And in my own research, one of the things that I became very interested in is something we call organizational silence, right? So when people aren't listened to, when their ideas are not held as valuable, that often provokes one kind of organizational silence. And, people watching might be thinking like, well, silence, that doesn't sound like a big deal. But in an organization that depends on ideas to inform work, and that circulation of ideas, that can actually be, if not crippling, like deadly to an organization.
Mhm.
And so I hear you when you talk about the protests that arose after the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of people did not see that as a form of communication at all, right? And
Mhm.
I think for me, what that got me thinking about is some people watching by now might be familiar with some of the pillars of white supremacy culture, right? One of them being the hyper focus on the written word, right? So it's if it's not in a contract, then it's not real,
Mm-hmm.
which again is like implicitly just so dismissive over all of the many signals that we are sending out to each other that do constitute communication. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on what, like, maybe strategies that people can be using in their own lives, in the workplace, while they're learning, about how to better decode the things that people are trying to communicate.
Well, the first step I think would involve observation. Just sitting back and observing people and how they're responding to the news. Don't be so quick to insert your judgment or your evaluation or even dismissing what someone is saying. I mean, because we are being bombarded with these images of most recently with George Floyd, and it's draining. I mean, I'm sure that it's draining for people in general, but for Black people, it's a form of racial trauma because we witnessed a Black man being murdered over and over and over again, and it can be debilitating. I mean, if you are exposing yourself to that image and other images as well, on a fairly consistent basis, and so that's why we as a people have to be very mindful of what we are ingesting. And if you have colleagues or friends who are Black, or people that really have true communication with, understand that we are dealing with a whole lot. And we just, some people have reached their limits. They are at a threshold. They are and I can even say we are exhausted. I mean, it's emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually draining. And instead of people trying to not necessarily be empathic, but you may not ever understand everything that someone is sharing with you when it comes to their experiences with systemic oppression. One of the best things that you can do, is listen, and then be as assertive as possible to break that cycle yourself. So, I mean, some people might say, I'm not comfortable going out in the streets to protest. You don't necessarily have to do that, but you can engage in healthy conversations with people, about what racism is, what discrimination is, and so on. And I think just taking advantage of those opportunities to talk to other, and I'm speaking specifically about white people, having those conversations with other white people, and not like leaning on other people of color to be a not just a spokesperson, but to be your teacher. I mean,
Mm,
if you have a close relationship with them, more than likely they're gonna trust you, and they hopefully will feel that they can share things with you, and that you're going to be truly listening. But those individuals need to really take it upon themselves to become more knowledgeable, about the history of racism and how it's impacting us currently. But I think that people are still too what's the word I'm looking for? Anxious about talking about race, because
sure.
and I think part of it has to do with the perception that they are a racist, or
Mm,
saying something inappropriate, making a slip up. And something
yeah.
I can say is important in my relationships with my white friends, is that I hope that I create a safe relationship where they can ask me questions, they can say things, and if they're wrong or out of line or whatever, I will tell them, but I will tell them that in love. But they get that luxury. Well, I'm not. Maybe that's too strong a word to say they get that luxury, but that's something that I reserve for people who I am close to, and
Yeah.
others. It's because it is so debilitating and draining. You have to. I don't want to say choose your battles, but you have to be very wise in terms of how you are going to use your various resources to make a difference.
Yeah. So it sounds like the relationship is a crucial component of that. And maybe um it's my perception that sometimes that's a very important factor that gets missed. And so sometimes I don't know about you, but sometimes I have the feeling that they're very well-intentioned people who are
Hmm.
seeing others who may have relationships with one another, kind of saying like, I see you, I hear you, these kinds of things that have become very quickly cliche. And so there's an element of kind of performativity that kind of enters into it. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's something that you become interested in. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yes, I sure can. I have an essay that's going to be coming out sometime this year, I think, and on a term that I think I've coined it. I don't know if anyone else has actually used it themselves, but it's what I'm calling performative feminism.
Oh,
Yeah, and that is a concept that I already had that brewing in my mind, and then I was on the phone, with a colleague and dear friend of mine, Dr. Kimberly Moffett, who is at the University of Maryland and Baltimore County, and she and I were talking, and I was reflecting on the ways that I see people, the ways that I had seen people, performing their identities, on social media. I mean, we all know that people will paint a certain picture of themselves on social media that might not be a true reflection of who they are in real life. And sometimes it is accurate. But what was concerning to me was seeing people who are in my field, or having heard from other friends about people that they know who they might be prejudiced, they might be racist, they have different ways they have biases, so they have different ways of thinking about people who are out group members, people who are different from them. And so they have this dialogue or this performance that's behind the scenes, but the way that they present themselves to the public is that they care. And
yeah.
so, if I don't know them personally, I'm going to take you at your word. I'm going to take you at your Facebook page or Instagram, or whatever social media, because that's what I see. So you've got this public facing image, which is it's problematic, because the person is not really genuine,
Right.
in their perceived belief in equality or fairness or justice. And so they're pretty much jumping on the bandwagon and saying, hey, I see you. I'm not saying that when I'm not saying that everyone who says I see you and I hear you, is engaging in performative
Right.
feminism, or performative, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, there are some people, who want people to see them in a certain way, and but they operate differently, in real life. And I think that who they are, what they're doing, and the attitudes they reflect, one on one, yeah, one on one or in private, that's a truer that reflection of who they are, as opposed to how they're using their social media. And so
Yeah.
I got really concerned about this phenomenon and this concept, because people were coming out of the woodwork, and they were direct DMing friends, and maybe emailing and texting them and saying, I'm here for you. And they're like, well, that's not how you always have been. Yeah. So some people were taking advantage of that, and I think
Yeah.
the best way, another way to kind of describe that behavior, is virtue signaling. I don't know if
Sure.
that's a concept that's been researched or whatever, but my TA, my graduate student Kyle Stanley, introduced that to me, and so I was like, oh, virtue signaling. Yeah, I see that happening quite a bit. And so the hope is that people would be willing to engage in authentic communication, and if they do that with people that they're close with, then they can use that as an opportunity to grow and be better people.
Yeah. I mean, we had a guest on not too long ago who is an LGBTQIA plus advocate in the UK, and he mentioned that for Pride, a company in the UK decided that they would support the queer community by releasing a sandwich, which was essentially a BLT with with avocado in it or something. And I mean, I get the sense that when people are virtue signaling, when they are being performative, they're trying to show that they are aligned, even if they are not genuinely aligned. But to me, a sandwich just seems like not nearly enough, and kind of like very off the mark. So I guess in situations where organizations or people might be more skilled at being performative, are there things that you found that people can kind of keep an eye out for, so they can kind of say, like, wait a minute, my workplace is saying that they are for all these things, that they're there for all these different people, but I'm not sure.
Hmm. Well, I would say that actions speak louder than words. That also ties back to one of the crises or principles of communication, which is that we as a people in general, tend to place more value and not necessarily value, but we have verbal and nonverbal communication, and you're going to trust the nonverbals more than you will, the verbal. For example, if someone says, someone asks you how you're doing today, how you're doing today, and you're like, "Oh, I'm fine." Well, that your response had a whole lot of attitude in it. So, we can see that there's a disconnect there. But now I think that we should really be observant of our environments. I mean, so that means that you are watching individuals and how they are engaging with each other, and look at the history of like different decisions that are being made, in your organization. Are people saying that yes, they want diversity, but they do something behind the scenes that's contrary to that? And so I think that by being much more observant and attuned, to different types of systemic oppression that occur, then that can help individuals realize that institutionalized racism gets or any other type of systemic oppression gets it's preserved and perpetuated by the behaviors of individuals in that organization. And so it's
Mhm.
not just like an empty building and you say that's institutionalized racism, and then people, go there for work for a little bit, and, they don't really, interact with the building, but when they leave it behind. No, institutionalized oppression or systemic racism, is the result of learned behavior that is
Yes.
ultimately, adopted by those individuals who are in power. And so that creates that perpetuates a system that it's oftentimes difficult to determine
Yeah.
if I mean it's so covert is what I'm trying to say. It's so covert that you may not always know that
Yeah.
this is what's going on. This is racism.
I mean, it's so interesting that you've mentioned it a number of times, like the importance of observation. And I can't help but make the connection from observation to self-reflection, because I know that my skill in observation deepened immensely as soon as I was able to start reflecting on what I was contributing, what I was bringing to the table. And actually, I started in on that path in a more kind of earnest fashion with one of my former professors, Jeffrey Pugh, who is actually one of your former students. And it also appears that he has dropped a question into the chat. So if you're open to it, I'd like to kind of so Jeff says, I am a former student of Dr. Harris many years ago, and her influence has shaped the way that I help hundreds of students, including, yeah, that's me. That's absolutely true, to understand how to manage conflict and communicate effectively across a range of differences, including race, culture, gender, and others. So I'm excited to see this conversation happen. Jeff, we're excited to have you here.
Yeah.
Right now, we are seeing, as Dr. Harris mentioned, a pandemic of hate and dysfunction in the way that racial groups interact and create narratives about each other. Miles, I don't know if we can get the rest of that question on screen, but yes, absolutely, Jeff. Yeah, I don't know if you want to crack into that a little bit, Tina. But we've talked a little bit about the pandemic of hate and dysfunction, but are there ways concretely that we can be using communication to kind of address the dysfunction that Jeff is mentioning?
Oh, I definitely believe that. Something that I, I guess you could say that I have created a motto that, and this is the working title of my book that I need to be working on this summer, is called "Dismantling Racism One Relationship at a Time." And I believe that it's in those different relational contexts where we can have these healthy, open, and honest conversations. They can not only can they be within the same race, but they can. I'm not going to say it's more important, but it's equally important to have those conversations within an interracial context where you have people who are from two different races that are coming together and they're talking about these different issues and how they're impacting their daily lives, their identity, their worldview, etc. And I see that there are a couple of keywords in the question, which are vulnerability and empathy. And I believe that those are really critical to talking about having these difficult conversations. And I will give you a quick example. I remember, I don't know how many years ago it was, but it was at least maybe 15 years or so ago, where I was teaching a graduate class. And so we were on a break, and I can't remember what I was talking about. I think I had talked about buying something on sale because I don't like to pay full price. But anyway, I forget what the exact statement was, but I used the word. Um, I said that someone was trying to like gyp me, and that I've heard it, not all the time, but I've heard it, and I used it. And then a graduate student told me, he was like, "Yeah, you probably don't want to say that." And I was like, "Why? Just tell me why, and I will adhere." And he told me that that was an offensive term that was used, or that is used against gypsies. And essentially there's a perception that they are thieves and so on. And I was like, oh, okay. At that point, I made a decision that I was never going to use that word again. And if I
Mm,
did use it, I would use it as an example of how we can change our language. And I didn't take offense to it. And I would say that in that moment I was vulnerable because this is a graduate student taking my class, and he's telling me that my language is inappropriate. I could have been angry about that. I could have, there could have been a backlash or whatever, but there wasn't, because I was like, oh, okay, thank you for letting me know, and I will never use it again. And I don't know, something that stuck with me in that particular situation, is that I said, well, have I ever met a gypsy? And it didn't matter. I don't think that I have, but I committed to removing that term, that slur, out of my vocabulary. And so I think that that was, the graduate student and I, we got along and still
yeah.
do. But I was still allowing myself to be vulnerable, and I think there might even be um, degrees of vulnerability and the different types of relationships that you have. And I think that if a person is really committed to growing and learning and being a better person and being more attuned to the different social issues that are going on, and right now you want to speak specifically to racial injustices, it's important for you to allow yourself to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
because
So,
you're not going to change. Mhm.
and just to clarify, like people, because vulnerability is a word that we've heard a lot of lately, but I'm not always so sure that it's always being understood as a way of how do I say this? Like, so instead, the opposite of vulnerable could be defensive, right? So like that interaction with your graduate student could have gone very differently, right? So you're the professor, you command a certain amount of respect by nature of that position, and very easily you could have been defensive about it and been like, well, I'm the professor of communication, who are you, right? That kind of thing. And I think in the workplace there's a lot of focus on feedback, but there's not a whole lot of training for employees about how to give and receive feedback. Right?
Mhm.
There are different models that are used, but often feedback is unfortunately leveraged as a way to get rid of undesirable people. And so there is a very real fear there of recrimination, not just in the workplace, but as you mentioned before, of being painted as a racist, a bigot. Um, and so, yeah, I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit. And just to kind of segue back to the rest of Jeff's question, it was a very long question, but it has since come in through to us behind the scenes. So I'll try to read that out a little bit. And Jeff is saying, like, in the current context, I'm interested in what both of you think about how multiple racial groups who have experienced marginalization and discrimination can communicate effectively, build solidarity and empathy, and avoid seeing each other as competitors within a power hierarchy that was not built to help them. So again, we have some parallels there with the workplace, because again, people are kind of in competition mode when they are afraid of being fired, for example.
Mhm.
And another example that Jeff gives is, for example, both Asians and Black people are being targeted with racial violence, how can people in these two groups develop empathetic solidarity and common cause?
Communication. Oh, it's not that simple, but in some ways, I think it is. We ought to take the opportunity to, engage with people who are different from us, and work towards being much more empathic and understanding. And I think that sometimes when you have different groups who are simultaneously experiencing different types of injustices, there is, I'm not going to say it's a tendency for everyone, but for some people there is a tendency to say that my hurt is worse than yours.
Yeah.
And hurt is hurt, pain is pain, and so we have to be cognizant of that. And I think that a barrier that exists that sometimes prevents us from having these uh, alliances, yeah, alliances is the word I'm looking for, is that sometimes people are thinking that um, it's my turn. It's this group's turn to, be, in the forefront. It's this group's turn to, have society focus on their issues and whatnot. But all these issues are going on, all of the time. And I think that, if we just sit back, and respect the fact that, hey, this is an issue that's going on. Okay, so yeah, I'll extend his question and focus on Asians and Black people. I mean, so we've got the verdict yesterday in the trial of the police officer who murdered George Floyd. That impacted a lot of Black people and other people, as well. But we also have these hate crimes that are being committed, excuse me, against Asian American Pacific Islanders. That's a problem. So we can't ignore one or the other, but we ought to have compassion enough to know that, okay, as a Black person, this is how I felt. This is how I responded when I heard the verdict. I surprised myself and I just started to cry. I mean, I just wept because I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we finally have had not justice, but accountability. But there also are, there's a rise in the number of attacks against Asian Americans, in the U.S. Well, obviously they're in the U.S. if you say Asian Americans, but I'm still mindful of that. I'm like, wait a minute, like what can I do, to be supportive? So I mean, I'm not going to go out in the streets and protest. COVID is still out there, but I will, when I run across articles that speak to the issues of other people, I'll post them on my Facebook page. I've had former students and friends tell me that if they want to know what's going on about race in our country or whatever, they're going to go to my website, not website, they'll go to my page and they want to see what I posted because they know that I'm going to have something to say there. And sometimes I'm just too tired and I don't do it. But I think that we ought to avail ourselves to the resources to which we have access to become more knowledgeable about the experiences and the different types of oppression that other groups face. We shouldn't just be focused on us. Yes, it's important, and yes, there need to be changes, but there are other groups that need to experience that change as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great and very thorough answer. So Jeff also was asking for my opinion. I don't know why, because Jeff taught me most of what I know. But anyway, one of the things that Jeff did teach me was if we try to address issues or problems or conflicts sequentially, then too much time may have passed to fully address those things. And so I definitely know that when I'm hurting, when I am in pain, the first thing on my mind is, how do I get relief for myself? Then I can think about other people. But the reality is, if I'm not able to work on multiple problems all at once, then ultimately I might miss out on the best solution.
Mhm.
And, I think underscoring that point is, when it comes to working through conflicts, working through really complex issues, There's a lot of people that have this attitude of, I'm just one person. I can't do anything by myself. That may be true, but if you've got a lot of people working together, making themselves vulnerable, connecting with others, developing those kinds of relationships, then suddenly a whole lot of amazing things absolutely do become possible. Like a lot of people have been focusing on the Mars rover, the helicopter flight that happened there. Well, no one person did that either, right? So that was a whole lot of people who had a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of insight, working on multiple interconnected problems. That's not quite the same thing as racism, to be sure. We are adding the layer of not only current but historical pain as well. And, for a very long time, there has not been great understanding between various groups in this country. And some of that is, well, it may be too much to say that it's by design, but it's certainly something that has been leveraged, right? So if we really want to get out of this mess from where I'm sitting, it's like, I've got to be as invested in Tina's humanity as she is in mine. And even if that trust is not exactly fully established, there's a little bit of faith that has to go in there as well, because we simply can't be testing each other all the time if we really want to develop those kinds of relationships. We have to allow people to show up or not. Sometimes we have to allow them to be fully present or not. Sometimes we gotta allow each other to be human, essentially, is what it comes down to.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I don't know if that answers that question, Jeff. I hope so. And you're not grading me anymore, so I feel pretty good about it. Um,
You mind if I take a minute to thank Jeff? Uh,
no, not at all.
yeah, I want to thank you for connecting Enrico and me so we can have this opportunity to have this wonderful conversation. And I am so proud of you. You've done a lot since you graduated, and you will always be one of my favorite people. Not just because of the connection, but you always have been and you always will be.
So I was also lucky enough to do Jeff's summer program in Quito, Ecuador, which is done in conjunction with Flaxo, Ecuador, a local university. And he took us through this really lovely exercise. Uh, and I can't remember exactly what it was for, unfortunately, but in the context of this exercise, he was kind of showing continuity of knowledge and knowledge transfer by using a stream as kind of a metaphor. And so I remember him very vividly kind of saying like, yeah, so all of the people that taught me, they had teachers as well. And now I'm teaching you. And there's this whole kind of relationship of learning, of continuity. And that's just like so very powerful to me, right? Like it used to be thousands of years ago that mostly knowledge was passed from down through families, and now we've kind of created a system where we are transferring knowledge among many different people. We don't always see that as relationships, but if we're digging down into what relationships are,
Mhm.
then that's what's happening. And so there's a whole lot of communication that is necessary to create those relationships. But the simple fact that we don't frame it that way means that we just end up kind of glossing over it. And I think that's a real tragedy, because if we were able to reframe things as relationships and to see those, I don't know, it may be uncomfortable for some, but those familial connections, like, so Jeff is kind of a bridge between you and myself, Tina. And then I really kind of wonder about what kind of impact that might have on our day-to-day communication.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that those of us who are, well, it's not limited to those of us who are in higher ed, but we can have an influence and an impact in the spaces that we occupy. I actually told my students something similar to this on yesterday, which was our last day of class, and I presented them with a certificate, and I told them that something that I've always purposed to do is that whatever space I'm in and I leave it, I want to leave it in better condition and shape than I found it. So how can I make, how can I have an impact, during that time, that I'm in that particular space? And I believe that we do that in the classroom because we are sharing knowledge with students. Sometimes students are resistant to it, other times they're open to it, and it is our responsibility to share that information with them. So yes, they're taking a class. They're going to be tested on the material. They're going to be tested on the content. But for me, it is more about what are you going to do with this information in the real world. Once you get out there, I want you to do well on all of the assignments, and I'll do whatever I can to help you be better in that regard. But how are you going to make a difference in the world with what you have learned? And it really blesses me when my students will come back and they'll tell me that they applied what they learned in the classroom, and ultimately when they're applying that knowledge, they're doing it with family, they're doing it with friends, and they might even be doing it with coworkers. I have one student who contacted me a few years ago, and she asked me if I still had on file a project that they had worked on for my interracial class. And what they had to do was to create a new type of media. Well, it had to be like a television show, movie, a magazine, or a website that promoted positive interracial communication. And I was like, no, I do not have that. I didn't tell her, I didn't use that tone, but I was like, I don't think I have it. I looked, through all the hard drives that I have, and I couldn't find it. And she eventually emailed me back, and she said, I did find it, and thank you so much. And I was like, I didn't help you, but okay. But, but the point of the story is that she told me that she needed this project. She and her group members, had created a magazine that was beautiful. I mean, they had a nice layout, and I forget what they called it, but I mean, it was incredibly impressive. And that's what she was using, on her job to demonstrate the kind of work that she can do, even though, she did it as a group. And, here I am, I'm making these assignments, I'm designing them so they can be enjoyable to the students and they can apply their knowledge. But I, did not have an awareness or or anticipation that it would help them, beyond the classroom. And so that really does bless me, because I'm like, wow, this is really having a huge impact elsewhere. And so I just get excited when I see my students invest in their work. And not, I mean, yeah, I want them to do well in the class, but there's potential for it to be transformative beyond the four walls of the classroom.
So if we can collect together kind of the spirit of everything we've been talking about for the past almost an hour,
Mhm.
what would you say that communication can do to promote positive change?
Communication can be transformative even when we may not realize it. Even if you take time to have a conversation with someone who is different from you, it doesn't necessarily have to be about race, but showing kindness and showing respectability, showing sensitivity and empathy to others, in a moment when you may not even you may not be thinking much of it, but it could mean the world to that person. I mean, don't be patronizing, but be willing to step outside of that box and to connect with other people, to connect with people who don't look like you, because not only might you learn a lot from them, but they could learn a lot from you. But be willing and open to be not only a teacher, but a student of life.
Yeah, I mean, in the absence of mind reading, the best we've got is communication, right?
Yes.
We had a question come in, and unfortunately, this gentleman had to go. But his question was around, like, Dr. Harris, what is the context around the quote, "Friendship isn't an ism"?
We talked about that the other day, and I think that, I think that what I was referring to was, there might be times when people want to use their friendships as an opportunity to learn, and in theory that is good. But when it comes to thinking about racism, sexism, and heteronormativism, and other forms of oppression, sometimes your friendships are not they're not always the place where you can talk about those things.
Yeah.
I mean, like, if I had a close friend, excuse me, who was of a different race, and they came and wanted to talk to me about race every single day, and they wanted lessons from me, that's not my job. They need to go out and do their own research, because if they're trying to find out more about Black Lives Matter, or any of the current issues that we're facing right now, and they come to me as a resource, I'm trying to deal with that as well. I mean, not, I mean, I understand what's going on, but I'm also experiencing it. I'm being subjected to it, and this is making me recall, past experiences with racism. And so I've
Yeah.
got all this going on, and then now you want me to like teach you? Thankfully, none of my friends, are like that, and so they're very mindful. And so,
Mm.
what I meant by that quote was that, or that statement rather, is that some people will try and use these different relationships, and it doesn't have to be even personal, but even professional relationships in the workplace. They go to that one person who is Asian. They may ask them, "Well, how do you feel about what's going on in the news right now?"
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean that's inappropriate.
I mean, it's extractive, right?
Right,
Yeah,
especially if you don't even have a relationship with that person.
I know.
So so in other words, we should not put the responsibility on the other person to teach us about oppression. That should be something that is organic to that relationship. Let it grow naturally.
Thank you so much. So, final question in our closeout. What would you love to see come out of your work?
I would love to see racism and all other forms of oppression just disappear. I know that's not going to happen, but we can work towards that, dismantling racism and other isms one relationship at a time.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates pretty deeply with me. And I am so, so grateful to Jeffrey Pugh for putting the two of us in touch. And it's been such a pleasure and privilege getting to know you a little bit and to spend time with you today, Dr.
Thank you.
Tina. Thank you so, so much for coming on the show. This is Enrico E. Manalo with Intentionally Act Live, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks again.